Welcome to part 2 of Norm's Motorcycles. Before we continue, I wanted to explain the reason behind the making of this programme. The world of personal transport is undergoing something of a transformation right now. The kids of today, my grandkids, are very unlikely to experience what us oldies did. To them, electric vehicles will be the natural way of things. Ice cars and motorbikes may well be seen as curiosities, dirty, expensive things that require constant upkeep. And if self-driving vehicles deliver half of the promised benefits, people might not bother having motorcycles or cars at all. Just summon one on your phone. It'll be at your door in 5 minutes. Back in the day, getting your first wheels was a big thing. I want my grandchildren to know firsthand how it felt. The excitement, the thrills, the spills. And with that, let's get back to the bikes. The 1000cc R100/7 Autumn Special was kitted out with a cockpit fairing, double front discs, a kickstarter and hazard lights. Woo! It was a great offer, but at £2,350 was a heck of a lot of money to find. I did struggle, but the R75/6 fetched £1,000 at trade-in. Not bad with 52,000 miles on the clock. My first new BMW was delivered in a crate in November 1978. I did not want the horrendous Blackpool dealer John Hall and Sons touching it. I was expecting German perfection. What a phenomenal disappointment. Just about every setting out of the factory was wrong. It ran on just one cylinder at first. That turned out to be the left-hand carburettor had a manufacturing defect. This bike was also very sluggish, heavy on petrol and unreliable. In the first few months, the spark plug suppressor caps failed, the rev counter and indicators malfunctioned, the hazard light flasher relay filled with rainwater and shorted out, the voltage regulator failed. I actually designed and made an electronic replacement for that. And an oil leak appeared at a point in the right-hand cylinder where there should not have been any oil at all. This turned out to be a metal casting fault. Eventually, I sorted all these issues, but it took some time. BMW's quality control in 1978 was clearly terrible. The R100/7 was a 979cc horizontally opposed air-cooled flat twin, producing 60 brake horsepower at 6,500 RPM. More importantly, it was the torquiest production motorcycle in the world at the time. 54 pounds-feet at 4,000 RPM. Lovely. And with its large 5.4 gallon or 24 litre fuel tank, it could cover over 200 miles at highway speeds. In other words, a real mile muncher. But what about that sluggishness? Well, right up to 7,000 miles, about 4 months old, I treated the bike quite carefully. I mean, you can't really hammer a 1000cc motorcycle for long without getting a speeding fine, or worse. But then I found myself needing to cover 400 miles in a hurry. That long, sustained thrash had loosened off the motor a treat. After that, it was economical and much quicker than it had been. In fact, this engine continued to get faster and more frugal on juice all the way to 40,000 miles. So what started off as a right lemon turned into a real gem. The electric starter on big twin-cylinder motorcycles has a lot of work to do. On a completely mad trip to Coniston Hall campsite on New Year's Eve 1978, it was snowing and minus 10 degrees Celsius. Tony Reddy and I had all the right gear for winter. We were as warm as toast in my Force 10 Mark V tent, used on Everest expeditions, you know. At minus 10, with the recommended 20W50 oil in the motor chilled to a glue-like consistency, chances were it wasn't going to go. The next morning, New Year's Day 1979, when I pressed the start button, it did start, just. But if it hadn't, the Kickstarter would have saved us. A cockpit fairing is quite good at keeping the worst of the weather off the rider. But when BMW offered their RS fairing as a retrofit kit, I jumped right in. It wasn't cheap, just over £1,000. With this wind tunnel designed full fairing, the bike could cruise all day at well over 100 miles an hour, whilst the rider played cards on the tank. The 100/7 was the bike I had when I met Sue. She wasn't keen on bikes, but she did 2 continental tours with me on it. Our 1981 route took us through Germany, Switzerland, Italy and France to spend a week in Fréjus on the Côte d'Azur. The ride through the Alps was fantastic. The heat in the south of France didn't bother the bike, but my legs were roasted behind those big cylinders. Ouch. It was decided to ride all the way home in one go. Nearly 1,100 miles in just 21 hours. Remember, no Channel Tunnel or M25 back then. Boy, that bike could cover some miles. Another first for BMW was the introduction of heated handlebar grips. I fitted a pair of these as soon as they became available in 1979. It was rocket science at the time, I can tell you. A little 98cc single-cylinder 2-stroke masterpiece, the Suzuki A100 was a delight to own. Mine was made in 1973 and, do you know, I can't remember why or where I bought it, but I'm glad I did. It meant I could travel the 10 miles to work at Wharton, leaving the big BMW tucked up in bed. Turning out 9.5 brake horsepower at 7,500 RPM doesn't sound much, but 50 to 60 miles an hour was no bother at all. Fuel consumption was around 80 miles per gallon and oil consumption about 400 miles per pint. Oil injection was a feature of all Japanese 2-strokes, extending engine life, reducing exhaust smoke a bit, and making life a lot easier when refueling. Mine had a damaged exhaust port thread. The cylinder ought to have been removed and the thread recut. A repair with set screws and gun gum exhaust sealant worked okay though. BMW's inline 4-cylinder K-series motorcycles, known as Flying Bricks, had appeared in 1983. They were water-cooled, fuel-injected and sounded very sophisticated. By 1985, I'd had the R100/7 for 7 years and 54,000 miles. I really fancied a K. A new one was out of reach at the time, you know, young family, mortgage, that sort of thing. But I wondered whether Nick Jeffries could do me a deal. He did. Nick accompanied me out on a couple of road tests just for fun. Wow, he was quick. I mean ridiculously quick. The bike I finally opted for ran much smoother than the rest. It would be some years before I found out why. Nick gave me a great trade-in price, about £1,800 I think. The K100 RS cost me £2,900 as memory serves. As with all BMWs at that time, it was quirky. Strange fuel level system that only half worked, handlebar switches that were different to every other bike manufacturer's. Yet it could murder long distance travel. Yes, even better than the R100/7. The motor pumped out 90 brake horsepower at 8,000 RPM. 63 pounds-feet of torque at 6,000 RPM, but it was lardy, 243 kilograms ready to ride. It was easy to overbalance and drop it when pushing it around the garage, and I did. Fuel consumption hovered around the 45 to 50 miles per gallon, which gave a decent 190 to 200 mile motorway range. Once I'd prized the service manual out of BMW, maintenance was easy enough. BMW tried to mystify their technology to make it sound much more difficult than it was. I think this was to scare you into taking it to the dealers. I did let Alan Jeffries Motorcycles do some work. They were better than most, but in the motorcycle world, the bar was set very low, I can tell you.
dripping with autism.
By 1985, my bike rallying had evolved into staying in hotels rather than camping. As a BMW club member, the Irish rallies appealed to me the most. In the mid-80s, there was virtually no tourism to Northern Ireland due to the Troubles. The quiet roads made it ideal for motorcycling, and the Ulster lads always looked after us very, very well. It was whilst travelling through Ireland to an Ulster rally that my smooth K100 suddenly started vibrating like an old Triumph. I was laying down some power to overtake a long line of trucks when bzzz, like a switch, the handlebars, seat and tank were all buzzing like a bag of angry wasps. Typically, the mechanics at Alan Jeffries said, "Well, they all do that, sir."
Gobshite!
A BMW guru, Howard Godolphin, told me that my bike had been a press hack at one time. In order to get the best reviews in the bike magazines, Howard had rebuilt the bike personally, paying particular attention to the jack shaft shock absorber. Don't ask. Suffice to say, this component had more than 20 production changes over the years. They never completely fixed the problem. With all this nonsense, why did I stick with BMW? Well, one day in June 1987, I'd been with my father-in-law, John Halliwell, on the steam train to Mallaig, arriving back in Fort William late on a Friday afternoon. I togged up at the hotel in Fort William, pressed the start button at 5 minutes to 5 and cracked open a beer at home in Blackpool just as the BBC 9 o'clock news was starting. Just over 4 hours to cover 300 miles. That through torrential rain on Beatock and Shap. I mean, it was June. A lad on a Honda CBR 1000F was left for dead, beaten by superior comfort, weather protection, larger fuel tank range and shaft drive. And that's why I stuck with BMWs. When inline fours vibrate, it's a horrible sort of tingling that is very tiring over long distances. And long distances was what I did. By this time I had a nice car, that was for short trips. So when a revised K was announced that claimed to cure all these issues, I was suckered right in. The RS Sports Tourer style of bike was what I really wanted, but that wasn't available. Only the luxury touring or LT version. For me, the upright riding position was pants. I hated it. But I loved the silky smooth 1100cc 16 valve motor. So in May 1992, I parted with my cash. It was brand new, I can't remember how much it was. With 100 brake horsepower on tap, it was quick enough, although you could feel the 290 kilograms weight all right. If I'd ever have dropped it, it would have gone right through the Earth's core to Australia.
Are you serious?
It was the only BMW bike I've had with no faults whatsoever, nothing. But I loathe that riding position. If you can imagine going round corners in an armchair, that's what it felt like. It wasn't my sort of thing at all. It did, however, have anti-lock brakes, a new experience for me, and it saved my bacon too. Riding to work one morning, my business in Arkwright Court, Blackpool, a young lady lost control of her Ford Escort on some ice. I applied the brakes, the ABS doing its stuff perfectly. Without it, I would have crashed. Overall, the bike was so lackluster, there are no stories of epic journeys to tell. Couldn't wait to get rid of it. The chance came when the bike was in for a service at Alan Jeffries Motorcycles in Shipley. A K1100 RS was available for a test ride. I loved it, so after just 13 months, in June 1993, J456DUG, known as Doug to us, was cleaned up and traded in. It was a lovely sunny ride home from Shipley in June 1993 on my spanking new K1100 RS. Running in new engines was important to maximise engine life and to ensure good economy in the long run. I always took running in very seriously. The A59 descends to the Tickle-Trout motorway junction, and one would have thought any engine would have cooled slightly running downhill, but not this bike. There was a hiss, followed by a glug, then hot coolant sprayed out of the radiator filler cap all over the bike. The temperature gauge read normal. Something was clearly not right. On arrival home in Polton, I found the radiator filler cap had no rubber seal fitted. Therefore, the cooling system could not pressurise and the coolant boiled over. Seems like BMW's quality control was still a bit iffy. You would never have gotten this on a Japanese bike. BMW insisted on fitting a new short engine in case the heat had damaged the block. No way had the motor got hot enough to damage it, so I declined the offer. This was to bite me in the butt later. The K1100 RS had the same 1098cc 16-valve 4-cylinder motor as my previous bike, the LT. For me, this bike was much more comfortable and immensely more fun. Along the way, BMW had raised the efficiency of the engine, so fuel consumption was really good by the standards of the day, about 50 to 55 miles per gallon. Happy I was, until one day traffic was unusually light on the M6 northbound, so I gave it the berries. It went very well too well to admit here. As I put her away in the garage, there was a strange smell, a whiff of glycol, engine coolant in other words. She'd blown a head gasket. Repaired under warranty, I thought that would be that, but no. The very next time I wound her up, the head gasket blew again. This time, BMW would not cover it under warranty and £400 was whizzed out of my wallet. I was furious. It made me wonder, did BMW have a manufacturing problem with cylinder blocks? And that was the real reason that they wanted to change my motor. Throughout the 90s, I was very busy building up my business, and with 3 young children, annual mileage was low. Even so, with my good riding mate Roy Topping, we did some Ulster BMW rallies and the odd run into the lakes and such. I doubt more than 5,000 miles a year was covered. Lean times on 2 wheels, you might say. I'd been firing and driving steam locomotives on and off since 1989. It was now serious at first, but by 1996 I was volunteering at 2 heritage lines, the Swanage Railway in Dorset and the Great Central at Loughborough in Leicestershire. What better way to travel there than by motorcycle? That head gasket blowing K had to go. I was angry with BMW and tried so hard to buy something else. To be fair, when I rode the R1100 RS Boxer Twin, a completely new design from the old R75 and R100 that I'd had, I was blown away. The handling was outstanding. It was light. The new 1099cc motor was 90 brake horsepower, quick enough. So BMW kept a customer, although they really didn't deserve it. I purchased the bike new from Southport Superbikes, so a new generation of mechanics could abuse my good nature. Whilst the owner of the business was great, his service manager was an ass. At pickup, arrangements were made to perform the first 600-mile service the following week. They still mess me about as only bike shops can. After waiting nearly all day in Southport, my bike was returned serviced with the assurance that everything was done to the highest standards ever seen in the known universe. Yet, it came as no shock to me, coming back through Stoke-on-Trent after a duty at Loughborough, the engine began to gently misfire. I found that the service had not been done. The valve covers had not ever been removed. The essential valve clearances were near to zero, the cause of the misfire. As so often was the case, I had to do the job again myself, properly. The bike ran great after that. I never took it to a dealer for a service again. No special tools were required, just the service manual, which I'd got somehow out of BMW. This new generation of Boxer have gotten quite good reviews in the press. I certainly like mine. Comfort, power, handling, brakes were all good. Long distance work was easy peasy. I'd ceased going to Ireland every year, as I had for over 20 years, so plying to and from Swanage or Loughborough was the name of the game. Dorset was a 600-mile round trip, Loughborough nearly 300. Doing that once a month racks up the miles. Over 20,000 miles were covered in the 3 years or so I had this bike. Why she went, illogically, had nothing to do with the bike itself, but BMW's arrogance. In 1992, Honda released their Fireblade. I took little notice. It seemed to me these bikes were for hooligans, lads who might ride 50 miles, then go home for a rest, exhausted. These bikes look like toys. Not for the last time would I be dead wrong. Out with the wife and kids on a rainy winter's day in Preston, I suggested we pop into Bill Head Motorcycles, just to keep the kids and me quiet for a bit. There, right before us at the front door, was a new pre-registered Fireblade at a bargain price. I must admit, I was very tempted. Back at work the next day, I happened to mention it to my business partner Brian,
Hello?
who reminded me that as a company motorcycle, it would attract full tax relief, and furthermore, we could claim back the VAT. Wow! I went straight back to Preston with a company checkbook and bought a Fireblade. At that time, I was a lardy chap, more than cuddly you might say. It came as a shock to find how tight a fit I was on that bike. Oh! Sue followed me home in the car and said I didn't look that happy on it. True enough, this blade had the infamous 16-inch wheels, which really good riders could deal with. I was not one of those, so I struggled a bit. The 1997 CBR 900RR had a 918cc inline 4-cylinder motor, putting out 124 brake horsepower at 10,000 RPM. It weighed only 202 kilograms ready to ride. Road testers said, if you open up a blade, make sure you're pointing in the right direction. They were right too, it was a seriously quick tool. I loaded her up to go to Loughborough and work on the railway. I thought it would be an ideal running-in trip. She purred along at 70 miles an hour with a lovely subdued burble. This model still used carburettors and had no fuel gauge, just an old-fashioned reserve tap. As the journey progressed, I began to wonder if the reserve tap had already been opened, as over 130 miles had been covered, and the tank was only 18 litres capacity in total. Surely such a high-performance beast couldn't be that good on juice. Well, actually, it had achieved 57 miles per gallon, a truly astonishing figure in my view. The CBR 900RR motor is powerful, efficient, reliable, tractable, smooth. It really does have it all. Since this was a company bike, to comply with the tax rules, it had to be available to all qualifying employees. One lad, Carl Eves, had a full motorcycle licence, so the bike was shared between me and him. He looked after it very well. In 1999, we did a big tour of Scotland, more of which in the next section. Carl took the Fireblade. It was fantastic, being great on fuel and dead reliable. Although with the quite racy riding positions, risk could ache a bit at slower speeds on those Scottish single-track roads. In the year 2000, my company went through a very tough period, and I had to instigate some quite dramatic cost-saving measures. Having a Fireblade on the books wasn't sending the right message to the rest of the staff, and so it was very reluctantly sold. John Bloor had purchased rights to the Triumph brand and set up an entirely new company based in Hinckley, Leicestershire. Using new designs, not related in any way to the Triumphs of old, these Hinckley Triumphs had been around since the early 1990s and were getting quite good reviews. Could it be that a British bike could once again fit my needs? Could I force myself away from the BMW clan after all this time? My R1100 RS was fine, but BMW had annoyed me over a car issue, so I sold the bike instead. A hollow protest, I know, but hey. The Sprint ST had a 955cc inline triple engine, like the Tridents of old, but fully modernised, with balancer shafts, fuel injection and modern manufacturing methods. It looked very well made. Power output was 108 bhp at 9,300 rpm, with torque rated at 70 pounds-feet at 5,700 rpm. It weighed in at a respectable 207 kilos. Handling was good too. It all looked very promising. The bike was collected from Bill Heads in Preston. I truly did not know what to expect. It was strange seeing that Triumph logo on such a modern bike, but would it be any good? Initial impressions were not good. I got maybe 200 metres before the gearbox stuck in third gear. I stopped, it freed off, so I carried on. They were known for this trait. It happened to me a few times. Bonkers, really. Then the battery failed. Then Bill Heads messed up. The first service was done, with parts being left loose, oil on the fairing, the list goes on. The first long ride to Swanage though was a good one. The bike was comfortable, ran sweetly, handled great and turned in over 60 miles per gallon. Impressive. I was confident the teething problems I'd had were things of the past, and an upcoming trip to Scotland with the 3 other lads would be a cracker. Car leaves on the company Fireblade, a neighbour Brian Godwin on his Honda Super Blackbird, and my old riding mate Roy Topping on his 1960 R60 BMW accompanied me on what is now known as the Northwest 500 route. The Sprint ST ran very well indeed. On one section between Inverness and Melvich, a slow road, it turned in 74 miles per gallon. Then it turned sour. Blasting down the Strathcarron road, the bike suddenly lost power, then recovered. As I slowed down to enter a lay-by to take some pictures, the lads were waving arms and shouting. The rear of my bike was on fire. It was the rear brake caliper that was producing all that smoke. And now the rear brake was jammed hard on. We couldn't move the bike at all. It was Roy who had the idea that it might be vapour locked. He pressed down really hard on the rear brake pedal, there was a loud click and the brake released. Now I'm sure I hadn't dragged the rear brake and overheated it. But even if I had, there must have been water in the brake fluid for it to lock. That's unacceptable on a new bike. Back home, Triumph refused to listen to any complaints and insisted it was all my fault. I replaced the master cylinder as a precaution and the caliper seals, which were cooked, at my expense. As the months went by, the bike started using more and more petrol. Triumph had had several recalls to reprogram the fuel injection. They had to be obeyed to maintain warranty, although the warranty seemed to be worth diddly squat from what I saw. My bike was now averaging 45 miles per gallon instead of 60. I'd had enough. Being the worst of all the bikes I've ever owned, I really did consider putting a match to it. The first week in September 2000 saw me ride my Sprint ST to Blackpool Honda, as John Hall's Motorcycles was now called. I asked if they could prepare the Honda VFR 800 in the window for delivery to me the next day. They confirmed that they could. So I gave them all the documents and keys for the Sprint ST and said I never wanted to see it again. I went home in a cab. Within the hour, they called me with the best offer I'd ever had for a trade-in, just £1,500 to change. Maybe you thought I was trading standards or a gangster, I don't know. But the VFR was ready on the Friday evening. I loaded it up, then went to Swanage for 2 weeks' work on the railway. What a trip that turned out to be. A national fuel delivery boycott had begun. To get to Swanage, one fuel stop was required. And although I could see some pumps were unavailable, I did get enough petrol to complete the trip. I wouldn't need any for the return journey for well over a week. Surely things would be back to normal by then. No. When the time came to return home, Swanage was still short of fuel. But luckily, the people I was staying with at McDonald's were relatives of the petrol station owners. They arranged for me not only to fill the bike up, but also 2 extra 5-litre cans so that I could get almost home. I set off that Saturday morning in mid-September with 20 litres in the main tank and 10 litres strapped to the back in bin liners to disguise them. I didn't want robbing. Naturally, economy was the aim of the game, to eke out every last drop of precious petrol. Joining the M5 motorway near Gloucester, I decided to stop at Strensham Services. This was the halfway home point, and it seemed sensible to get that 10 litres off the back carrier into the much safer main tank. Strensham was like a war zone. I'd never seen anything like it. Hundreds of cars awaiting a fuel delivery. I truly thought I was going to get mugged as I decanted that 10 litres of go juice into the main tank. Traffic on the M5 was unusually heavy and very slow, so I turned west onto the A44, joining the A49 at Limster. This turned out to be a good move. Not only was the traffic light, but there was fuel all the way home north from there. The Honda VFR 800 Fi was a good machine, highly developed, now with fuel injection. It was a great sports tourer, capable of big distances and a bit of fun. The V4 16-valve engine put out 110 brake horsepower at 10,500 RPM. With a curb weight of 208 kilograms, this bike would touch 150 miles an hour. Mine was dead reliable with no issues whatsoever. Fantastic. However, it wasn't a perfect bike. For some reason, motorcycle manufacturers don't design ease of maintenance into their products. The VFR required servicing at 4,000, 8,000, 12,000 and 16,000 mile intervals, each service getting more complex. The 16,000 mile service involved checking the valve clearances. The official Honda price for this was £800. I had no doubt Blackpool Honda at that time would have charged me the full whack, but done less than half the job, so I set about it myself. It was complicated. It was hard. I actually cried at one point. It took me several days to do, but it got done completely and properly. So horrid was the task, I vowed I'd never do it again. As things turned out, it got traded in shortly afterwards anyway.